Defense has never been more important in fantasy football because let's face it, you're either in week 2 of your fantasy playoffs or you're fighting for pride at this point, and either one you want to win. So we're going through today's top 12 defense rankings for week 16 fantasy football, an update from Friday's pre-week 16 fantasy football rankings. So make sure to go down there and drop a like on this video and subscribe to the channel to show your support because I'm doing everything I can to get us ready for the fantasy football playoffs week 2. So getting into our first tier right here, I've got the Bills defense at number 1, and they get the pleasure of taking on the New England Patriots here. So there's a couple things here, right? If you've been paying attention to the Bills over the last several weeks in particular, they've played really tough opponents, and they've been in obvious shootouts where Josh Allen had to put on the superhero cape and probably carried a lot of people through their fantasy football playoffs if you have Josh Allen. But here's the thing. The Bills obviously get a huge break in the schedule right here versus New England Patriots, who I have been covering them for a long time, have been really turnover prone ever since Drake May took over. The guy's on a massive turnover streak, and their offense just simply doesn't score enough points. They're kind of a mess. So this is a great matchup here in Buffalo to kind of take their foot off the gas a little bit and not have to take on an opponent that can easily put up 30 points on them offensively. And the other part is, even in those 2 straight bad games that they just played against the Los Angeles Rams, the Detroit Lions, they're still the defense number 10 in fantasy football, averaging 7.4 fantasy points per game because they're getting interceptions, they're getting sacks. That's what you need from your fantasy defense here. And you will go through it, throughout the rest of these rankings here. There's a lot of quarterback decisions that have been made ahead of week 16 that will affect the offenses and the defense that are taking them on and the effectiveness of the defenses in fantasy football. This is one of the lone ones that hasn't been messed with as far as quarterback change here. And I do think the Bills will be a really good play this week. At number 2, I've got the Packers defense versus the New Orleans Saints. This one was one of my favorite matchups heading into the week when I did the original rankings earlier on Friday last week. Look, the Packers defense has actually been really, really good in fantasy football for the majority of the year. They're a top 5 defense as of right now, averaging 8.8 fantasy points per game because they are so opportunistic. That's the difference between a really good NFL defense and a fantasy defense. Now, they've been a much better NFL defense than they were last year, but fantasy football-wise, they've been awesome because they have 40 sacks, 14 interceptions, and 12 fumble recoveries. Those are the big plays you need in fantasy football from a defense. And New Orleans here, I get it. They almost just beat the Washington Commanders. That's the Commanders defense, man. The Packers defense just absolutely took it to a hot Seattle offense on the road in Seattle on Sunday night. Green Bay's defense is for real, man. I don't see the New Orleans Saints coming out of this one unscathed. Whether they play Jake Haener, whether they play Spencer Rattler, I don't really care. The New Orleans Saints may not even have Kamara this week. This is a problem because they have no playmakers whatsoever. The Lions defense at number 3 at the Chicago Bears. Now, obviously, I love the matchup here. I've been talking about this for the majority of 2 weeks now at this point. The Bears look like a defeated, finished team. They look like they're ready to all take a trip to the Bahamas, take a trip to out of state, wherever they want to go. They want to go to somewhere warm and where they don't have to think about football right now. That's the impression I've gotten from the Bears over the past 2 weeks in particular. The Lions obviously have been a really good defense in fantasy football the most of the year. Now, here's where I pump the brakes a little bit. The Detroit Lions have had so many defensive injuries. Obviously, they were able to overcome Aiden Hutchinson's injury, but it's not just Aiden Hutchinson at this point. Their back end has been injured. Their front 7 has been really injured. They just lost a key defensive piece again for the rest of the season just on week 15's game. This defense is falling apart a little bit. So they're in the first tier for a reason here. I still think they're going to smother the Chicago Bears, but I do have the Bills and the Packers strategically ranked over them. Dropping down to our next tier, I've got the Broncos defense at the Los Angeles Chargers. So 2 things are obviously clear at this point. Number 1, the Broncos have a really good defense in fantasy football. They are the number one defense in fantasy football. 10.9 fantasy points per game because they have 49 sacks. 49. That's really what's carrying them. 14 interceptions is a really good number as well. But the 49 sacks thing, they're getting after every single opponent they face. The Chargers are having major issues here. That's reason number 2. The Chargers offense just got crushed again by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense. Without J.K. Dobbins, who I've been discussing for weeks now, as their most valuable offensive playmaker by far. Without J.K. Dobbins, they can't put points on the board against anybody. Even against a lousy Tampa Bay defense for the majority of the season. Tampa Bay was not as good as the Broncos defense. Now, the Broncos, this is a divisional matchup. That's why they're not in tier 1, because I do think there's a sliver of doubt that they could actually be in an even game, and the Chargers don't usually turn the ball over a ton. So the Broncos defense, I've got them down here in tier 2 to kind of hedge that bet a little bit, but I still think they're a really good top 5 play this week. The Vikings defense at number 5 at the Seattle Seahawks. So the Vikings defense, obviously, they've been fantastic as well. Number 2 defense in fantasy football, 10.4 fantasy points per game, 42 sacks, 20 interceptions. This defense gets after your quarterback, and they are opportunistic as a defense gets. This defense takes all the big plays that you need in fantasy football. Now they're taking on an offense that may very well be without Geno Smith this week. Now, I read that his initial reports were optimistic, like there was no structural damage to the knee or anything like that. He may or may not play. I mean, there's no guarantee that Geno Smith plays. And if it's Sam Howell, good luck to the Seattle Seahawks moving the ball very much. That guy could not play, especially against a mean pass rush, which he played against in Green Bay. So I just don't know if the Vikings are really going to struggle that much. Even if it is Geno Smith, I still think they're a really good defensive play this week. And then the Falcons defense at number 6. It feels weird having this defense this high in my rankings, but a couple things made me feel comfortable. First of all, they're playing the Giants. They're obviously getting a fantastic matchup here against the New York Giants. This defense is the number 26 defense in fantasy football right now, averaging 5 sacks per game. But you know what's really kind of turned me on to the Atlanta Falcons at this point in the offseason, this point in the season rather, is that if you look over their last 3 weeks, they've actually had 2 really strong games. One game was in week 13 off of a bye week versus the Los Angeles Chargers. They had 11 fantasy points in that game. Then you take a look at last week, they had 20 versus the Las Vegas Raiders on Monday night. Now, here's the thing. They haven't even been getting tons of turnovers during that time. They have 4 turnovers in the last 3 games, which is a good number, but they have a total of 13 sacks the last 3 games. That's like almost more than they had before the bye week, like what they had in week 12. Their defense has actually turned it on a considerable amount. So at this point, I think the Falcons defense can be really trusted against a failing New York Giants team. Look, the reality is that the fantasy football playoffs are already hard enough. And especially when you have to make sure that you're getting ahead of your waiver wire claims, that could be a really tough task as in itself. But if you're really confident in your team moving on to the Week 17 NFL Championship for the fantasy playoffs, then you could really use a tool like over at Giddy Up Sports. Giddy Up Sports has this super cool automated waiver wire machine where it essentially just makes sure that you can grab a player, grab a team, grab whoever you want, prioritize them in order ahead of time. So you could schedule a waiver wire pickup weeks in advance on Giddy Up's tool. This is a super cool automation that was set up by one of my buddies over there. I cannot endorse this site enough. This is something that I particularly would love to use. As somebody who does YouTube on his own, it's a one-man show over here, and a lot of times in my own leagues, I kind of forget sometimes to pick up waiver wire players. This tool is perfect for me particularly, and I'm sure it's perfect for you as well. Now, right now, this is only on Yahoo Fantasy Football, but I can tell you this for sure. If you have Yahoo Fantasy Football, this is a fantastic tool, and it's also free. So just go over to GiddyUpSports.com, click the link in the comments below, and get out ahead of your waiver wire to win the fantasy football playoffs. Now, dropping down to our next tier, the Rams defense at number 7 at the New York Jets here. Now, listen, with the Rams defense here, the Rams really came out strong against the 49ers, and I said they were a top 12 defense last week. The Rams defense, right now, they're the number 14 defense in fantasy. They've been a little bit hot and cold, and I really do think that this New York Jets matchup could go one of 2 ways. Either one, it's going to be a little bit of a shootout because the Jets have been looking really good offensively. Or number 2, the Jets end up just kind of collapsing on themselves because the Rams defense is actually the real deal. Because I think the Rams defense is really talented. They have plenty of guys on the pass rushing side. Byron Young, Jared Verse, those 2 guys are animals, man. And they also could get turnovers as well. So it's really inconsistent here, man. It's kind of a gut call for me because I ultimately do believe in the Rams defense. I think the Jets have been firing on all cylinders offensively, but I ultimately just believe that the Rams defense is a really good one. That's why they're here at number 7 for me. The Colts defense is number 8 versus the Tennessee Titans this week. Look, the Colts defense actually was going to be a lot higher. Like in the original rankings I had before week 15, when I ranked these guys, the Colts defense was in tier 2. I thought they were going to be a really good play. I have a couple reservations about this one. Number 1, if the Colts can't generate offense, this team stinks. Like, their defense was good in fantasy football for a while because of the fact that they were able to get a bunch of big plays and turnovers, man. Against the Denver Broncos, they did fine. They had 1 sack, but they had 3 interceptions against Bo Nix. Now, the problem this week is that it's not Will Levis anymore. They benched him for Mason Rudolph. So Mason Rudolph not being as turnover prone as Will Levis will definitely lower the upside of this defense this week. But at the same time, I don't think the Tennessee Titans can put up many points as well. So I think that may end up just being a low-scoring game where maybe they get 1 or 2 turnovers off the Tennessee Titans, and they could be a good spike play on this defensive week. But at the same time, I think they've got a really stable floor here at number 8. The Chargers defense at number 9, rounding out this tier versus the Denver Broncos. Exactly the same matchup as the Broncos here. I think that this could be a very, very slugfest type of divisional game right here. They obviously, the Chargers are in a unique position right now, right? Their defense is really good in fantasy football. They just got lit up by a powerhouse offense by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, the Broncos have been firing at all cylinders offensively as well. That's why I don't trust the Chargers as much as I trust the Denver Broncos here. But again, you can't forget what the Chargers defense has largely been in fantasy football this year. They're the number 6 defense in fantasy, averaging 8.1 fantasy points per game because they get after your quarterback at 40 sacks this year and 14 interceptions. They're very opportunistic as well. So Bo Nix is kind of on this turnover run right here. What if it's a low-scoring game? Neither team reaches 20 points and both throws in the 2 picks. They've got a pretty solid floor here this week, in my personal opinion, just because of the way that Bo Nix has been playing over the past several weeks, just throwing the interceptions he can. Even if he matches it with points, I think the interceptions are going to be a big deal for fantasy defense this week. And dropping down to our last tier, I've got the Eagles defense at the Washington Commanders. Now, I think this is also a really good example of the differences between a really good NFL defense and not as great of a fantasy defense. They're a fine fantasy defense. The Philadelphia Eagles are the number 9 fantasy defense this year. 7.4 fantasy points per game. But this defense is like number 1 against scoring, number 1 against rush, number 1 against pass. Like, they're a fantastic real-life defense. In fantasy football, 39 sacks, only 8 interceptions, and 8 fumbles recovered. They're not getting the big plays necessary for fantasy success. Now, the Commanders this week, it could very well easily be a domination game where they kind of smother the Commanders. The Eagles are playing dominant football right now. It could very well happen. The first time they played the Washington Commanders, they got 3 sacks and they had an interception against Jaden Daniels. It could very easily happen again. I just don't think that their ceiling is particularly high because they really haven't proven to have a high ceiling much of any week. So I don't think that changes against a Washington Commanders team that is fighting for playoffs. I think they've got a really safe floor, but not as high of a ceiling this week. The Steelers defense at number 11 at the Baltimore Ravens. I'll tell you what, they were a lot higher originally too, because the Steelers defense all year has been fantastic in fantasy football. Now, they ran into some problems last week in particular, and I'll tell you what they are. The Steelers defense obviously played the Eagles. They actually still came out with a good fantasy game, even though they gave up 27 points. Well, how did they do that? 3 sacks on Hurts and 2 fumbles recovered. This defense gets at least a turnover per game. And against the Baltimore Ravens the first time, they had 3 turnovers. Now, where is the defining factor here? TJ Watt gets injured versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Apparently, they're optimistic, but he did not practice on Tuesday, and they are playing on Saturday. So if he does not play, this team will not do good in fantasy football. They are really bad without TJ Watt. The record is really bad without TJ Watt for Pittsburgh. So just consider a few things. If TJ Watt misses, this is basically their ceiling right here. Because I do still think Mike Tomlin does know how to play Lamar Jackson very well. Better than any other coach in the league, aside from maybe Steve Spagnuolo over in Kansas City. But at the end of the day, I don't think that they'll be able to hold them as well as they did the first time if they do not have TJ Watt. So this is kind of where I'm having them ranked right now, assuming Watt does not play this game. And at number 12, the Bengals defense. Again, originally we're a little higher. They've run into a problem as well. The Bengals defense has actually been low-key really good in fantasy for basically the past 3 weeks. They have kind of like climbed out of the abyss of fantasy defenses to be the number 22 fantasy defense right now. They have 25 sacks. They basically have one guy who gets all their sacks, that being Trey Hendrickson, and they have 12 interceptions, man. So this defense actually can come up with big plays and sacks. Now, again, the Browns offense, I still do believe will be a solid play, to have a defense against this week. but they don't have Jameis Winston to pick on. Jameis Winston has been benched for Dorian Thompson-Robinson. Bad for wide receivers in for Cleveland, bad for David Njoku, and also not as good for a fantasy defense. But Dorian Thompson-Robinson is not anything good. That guy has his best chance is getting more rushing yards, but either way, I don't see them putting up a ton of points on the Bengals defense. So either way, I still view this as a pretty safe floor pick with the potential for still a really high ceiling as well. So let me know how your lineup is shaping up this weekend. If you want to see the top 30 wide receivers for this week, click on this video right here.